I had barely unpacked my first box when the sound of tires crunching down my driveway made me look up. It wasn't a neighbor stopping by to welcome me or a friend checking in. No, it was a convoy of HOA board members, clipboards in hand, marching toward my lakefront property like they owned the place. Their eyes didn't wander over my moving truck or the still-wrapped furniture. Instead, every one of them was locked on the wooden dock stretching out into the water, the very reason I had chosen this house. Before I could even catch my breath, one of them announced that the dock wasn't allowed and needed to be removed immediately. The timing was almost unbelievable. I hadn't even finished moving in, yet here they were storming in with demands as if they had been waiting for me. I tried to explain that the dock was legally registered and had been standing there for years, but they weren't interested in listening. Their tone was sharp, their words heavy with authority, and for a moment I wondered if I had made the biggest mistake of my life moving into this community. Neighbors peered through blinds, curious but cautious, leaving me to face the pressure alone. The board members seemed confident they could push me around, convinced I would fold under the weight of their rules. What they didn't realize was that I wasn't the type to give in so easily. This lake had a long history, and so did the dock. And while the Ho thought they could intimidate me, they had no idea who they were really dealing with or the local enforcer who had been guarding these waters for years. That's when things took a turn they never saw coming. I had spent months searching for the right place before I found this house by the lake. The view of the water, the quiet mornings, and especially the dock had sealed the deal for me. I pictured fishing on summer evenings, tying up a small boat, maybe even watching the sunset with friends. The dock wasn't just a piece of wood to me. It was part of the dream I worked so hard to finally make real. So when the Ho stormed in demanding it be torn down, it felt like they were trying to rip that dream away before it had even started. The strangest part was how quickly they reacted. I hadn't even introduced myself to the community yet, but they were already at my doorstep, quoting rules and bylaws. It made me wonder if they had been watching for weeks, waiting for the sale to go through, ready to make me their next target. The way they carried themselves, you could tell they had done this before. This wasn't just about a dock, it was about power, control, and making sure I understood who was in charge. Later that evening, while unloading boxes, an older neighbor wandered over quietly. He didn't say much, just gave me a knowing look and muttered, "They always go after the dock first. But don't worry, the lake has a way of sorting these things out." His words stuck with me. What did he mean by that? Was there some history between the Ho and this shoreline that I didn't know about? As the sun set, the dock stretched out into the fading light, calm and unbothered, as if it had weathered storms like this before. I couldn't shake the feeling that this battle had only just begun, and the real story of the lake was waiting to surface. The following morning, I woke up to the sound of voices drifting across the water. From my porch, I could see two home members standing at the end of the dock, snapping photos as if gathering evidence for some case against me. My stomach tightened. It wasn't enough for them to confront me once. They wanted proof, leverage, and maybe even to scare me into backing down. I walked down to ask what they were doing, but before I reached them, they turned and left without a word, their silence heavier than any threat. As I settled into the neighborhood, I started noticing things I had missed at first. Some houses had docks, some didn't. A few looked newly built, others clearly decades old. Yet the ones still standing all seemed tied to long-time families who had been here for generations. Newer homeowners, however, whispered about losing theirs to the Ho. It wasn't written anywhere, but the pattern was too obvious to ignore. The dock wasn't just wood on water. It was a symbol of who held power and who didn't. One afternoon, I struck up a conversation with a man at the local bait shop. When I mentioned where I lived, he chuckled and said, "Oh, you're the one they're circling now." He told me stories of past homeowners who fought the Ho over docks, boats, even fishing rights. Some gave in, others sold their homes, and a few. Well, he said the lake itself seemed to protect them. His words echoed the neighbor's cryptic warning, adding another layer of mystery I couldn't ignore. Meanwhile, the Ho ramped up their efforts, sending me letters, quoting regulations, and hinting at fines. But behind every threat, I could sense their unease. It was as if they knew the lake wasn't entirely theirs to control, and crossing me might awaken something they weren't prepared to handle. Days turned into weeks, and the pressure only grew heavier. Every time I came home, I half expected to find a notice pinned to my door or, worse, a crew waiting to dismantle the dock without my say. The board wasn't letting up. Their letters grew sharper, their warnings louder, and their visits more frequent. It was clear they wanted to make an example out of me, the new guy who dared to question their authority. But with each demand, my resolve only hardened. Late one night, I spotted a flashlight beam cutting across the lake, aimed directly at my dock. My first thought was that it was a neighbor, but then I noticed the figures standing on shore, whole board members again, jotting notes, pointing, whispering among themselves. They weren't just enforcing rules anymore. They were obsessed. The dock had become their battleground, and I was caught in the center. I wasn't alone, though. A handful of neighbors began quietly reaching out, sharing their own run-ins with the HOA. One family told me how their boat lift had been targeted until they fought back and won in court. Another confided that they had nearly sold their home after constant fines and harassment. The stories painted a clear picture. The HOA didn't just enforce rules, they thrived on intimidation. Yet there was also a quiet resistance in the community, people waiting for someone to finally push back hard enough. And then came the breaking point. One morning, I woke to the sound of chainsaws revving near the shoreline. Rushing outside, I saw workers in safety vests, flanked by HOA members, preparing to cut apart my dock. My heart pounded as I realized this was it, the showdown they had been building toward. The lake was still, the neighbors gathered, and all eyes turned to see what would happen next. I raced down the lawn, shouting for the crew to stop, but the HOA president stepped forward, waving a folder stuffed with papers. He claimed they had official approval to remove the dock, insisting it violated community bylaws. But as he spoke, something unexpected happened. A voice cut through the crowd. It was the same older neighbor who had given me that cryptic warning on my first night. He walked slowly toward the shoreline, his cane tapping the ground, his eyes fixed on the board members. "You don't have the authority to touch that dock," he said firmly. The workers froze, glancing at one another. The HOA president tried to dismiss him, but the neighbor pulled out a worn envelope, sealed and marked with the emblem of the county office. Murmurs spread through the gathering crowd. Apparently, years ago, a special easement had been granted to protect certain docks around the lake, and mine, by inheritance through the property, was one of them. Board members' faces went pale, but instead of backing down, they doubled down. "That agreement is outdated," the president barked, signaling the crew again. That's when another surprise hit. A white truck pulled up near the shoreline. Out stepped a uniformed officer from the county's lake authority, clipboard in hand. The timing was almost uncanny. Word must have traveled fast, and now the so-called lake enforcer was here, the very person the HOA seemed desperate to avoid. The tension was suffocating. Neighbors leaned forward, whispering, phones recording as the officer approached the dock. The HOA demanded action. I stood frozen, unsure whether this was the moment my dock would be saved or destroyed. The lake itself was silent, like it too was waiting for the next move. The standoff had escalated into something far bigger than anyone expected, and it was about to come to a head. The lake officer walked straight past the HOA president, ignoring his outstretched folder, and stopped at the edge of the dock. He studied it carefully, scribbled notes, then turned to the crowd. "This dock," he said, his voice steady, "is fully protected under the county's easement. Anyone attempting to dismantle it without authorization is in violation of state law." Gasps rippled through the neighbors. The workers shut off their chainsaws immediately, stepping back as if they wanted no part in what was about to unfold. The HOA president's face turned red, his words tumbling out in frustration. He tried to argue about bylaws, fines, and community standards, but the officer cut him off. "Your authority ends where the water begins," he declared. It was the moment everyone had been waiting for. The HOA's iron grip had finally cracked in front of the entire neighborhood. For the first time since moving in, I felt the weight lift off my shoulders. My dock, the very reason I chose this home, was safe. But just as relief washed over me, the final twist came. The officer turned back to me and said, "While your dock is protected, it comes with responsibility. You're now the caretaker of this section of shoreline." He handed me a binder filled with old agreements, rules, and maps tied to the easement. The neighbors stared, surprised as the meaning sank in. The hoe couldn't touch my dock, but I was now bound to uphold the very regulations they had tried to use against me, only this time with the county standing behind me. The president stormed off, humiliated, while whispers spread across the crowd. The lake had chosen its side, but it had also chosen its guardian. I hadn't just defended my dock, I had inherited the lake's legacy. In the days that followed, the neighborhood seemed to shift. People who had once watched from behind their curtains now stopped by to introduce themselves, some even apologizing for not stepping in sooner. They admitted they had been living under the HOA's shadow for years, afraid of fines or retaliation. My stand against the dock dispute had shown them that the HOA's power wasn't as untouchable as they once believed. The lake officer's ruling became the talk of the community, and for the first time, the board's authority was openly questioned. As for me, I settled into my new role as caretaker of the shoreline. At first, I worried it would feel like just another burden, but it turned out to be the opposite. The responsibility connected me to the lake in a way I hadn't expected. I learned the history of the water, the old agreements that kept it shared and fair, and even why certain docks had been allowed to remain. It wasn't just about rules, it was about respect for the land and the people who lived around it. That deeper understanding made every sunrise over the dock feel earned. The hoe, bruised from the public loss, grew quieter. They still held their meetings and sent out notices, but the aggressive tone was gone. Neighbors began speaking up more, no longer afraid to question decisions. The balance of power had shifted, not just for me, but for the whole community. Looking back, it's almost strange to think the fight started over a dock. What seemed like a small piece of wood over water became a turning point for an entire neighborhood. I had moved here searching for peace by the lake, and though the battle was unexpected, it gave me something even greater, a community that finally found its voice.